is Pamela Marshall. I'm a retired academic, and every now and then I still do some academic advisory work and write papers for conferences. And I was asked today to give a talk about the population of the medieval castle and how people lived in medieval castles, not when they were in crisis, not when they were under attack, which was actually quite rare, but on a day-to-day level, and that's what I'm aiming to do. First, let me begin by thanking you very much for inviting me to speak to you today, because it's always such a pleasure to meet societies like yours, and also to be in the Welsh borders, and it's such a beautiful part of the world, and in Ludlow in particular, which is a fabulous town. As Philip says, I've been asked to talk about who was living in medieval castles and what it was like to live in one on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence by asking you to wipe out the Hollywood view that you've all got deep in your psyche from childhood, because I'm sure this audience is sophisticated enough to understand more about how a medieval castle worked. Now, what I'm attempting to do is to look at the medieval household within the castle, how it functioned when it wasn't in crisis. Not when it was under siege. That was actually not very often in most cases, and in many cases not at all anyway. But when it was running as normal, in inverted commas. And I'm going to stress one or two points to begin with. First of all, it's very difficult to speak in general about medieval castles. It seems to me that much of their fascination and the interest that they hold is based in their variation and their individuality. They're built by the highest ranks of medieval society, by the governing classes, by kings, by counts, by bishops, but they also trickle right down to manorial level, where you would find a man, it's usually a man, not always, who might be of fairly modest means in terms of sitting on the hierarchy of the ruling class. But nevertheless, they aspire to build castles. And it's clear that when you're looking at the highest level of medieval castle, it's going to represent a standard of living that's not always available to those on the lower rungs of that social ladder. Nevertheless, you should bear in mind that even if they couldn't afford to keep up the standards of those higher up, they would certainly have aspired to do so, and they may have tried to follow their own watered down version. So with that proviso, I'm going to refer very quickly to sources. We have some documentation that give us snippets of the practical running of a castle, and what it was like to live in one. And I have to say that had they had Facebook, life would be a lot easier, because we seem to be obsessed these days with documenting every small detail of our day-to-day lives. They weren't really into that in the Middle Ages. So the documentation really is quite, in terms of, is quite snippety. We have official references in royal accounts, for example, in the Pipe Rolls, which give an account of royal expenditure on their own castles, in the itineraries of the medieval kings, so we can keep an eye on how long they're spending in any particular castle and when, up to a point. They're not complete. We have some information from chronicles, but usually it's in passing. It's usually a passing reference because they're focused on the major picture of what's going on at some major event. From the 14th century, and they're very common by the 15th century, we have household orders that give some insight into how life in the castle was conducted, and the great house for that matter, even down to table manners. And there are other elements of the organisation of medieval society which I'll refer to later. One of them is the habit of bringing up other people's children. When a child gets to about the age of 7, in a greater household, they were sent away to be brought up by another household, and you in turn would take in children from their households or different households. And I'll refer back to that. It adds a layer of complication. And then we should bear in mind the size of the household will vary enormously according to the social level of the owner of the castle. So in some households we might have a number of household knights, whereas in less extravagant households there may be none at all. You might also have multi-generational living, so you've got the elders still hanging about, usually dowagers, and so you've got to look out for the accommodation of granny, as well as the accommodation of the household and children directly in the household. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute and think about what defines a castle. I'm showing you here an aerial shot of Dover Castle, the key to England, and it's a supreme image of what a castle should be, a magnificent fortress. But we should remember that the generally accepted definition is that a castle is not just not only a fortified building, but it's also a private home. That's what makes it a castle rather than a fort. And so immediately you've got two functions. But in addition to those two functions, castles were also serving as administrative centres. They have judicial functions. They stand as a visible symbol of their owner's power and status. And at the highest level of society, they might have served as venues for diplomatic missions. They might have acted, albeit temporarily in some cases, as royal treasuries. But generally speaking, when the owner of the castle is in residence, assuming the castle's not under threat in any way, shape or form, they will be doing some entertaining. So we're looking at the castle as a backdrop for social life, for feasting, but also for treating your guests to sporting entertainment, such as hunting, the obvious one, and castles are, much work has been done on the castle in the landscape and the addition of deer parks and so on and so forth to facilitate that recreational aspect. And also in later castles, the addition of lists so that you could have jousting activities going on. They have well-tended gardens. There is much more to the castle as a residence than simply as a place to eat and sleep, and in a secure place that can be defended. Now, all of these varied activities, needless to say, required staff. Not all needed to have lived within the castle walls, but a fair proportion would have done so. So let us try to bear these various functions in mind as we go through the rest of my talk and think about who was involved in the foreground, but also in the background. Now, the defensibility of the castle clearly requires manpower, and the defensibility of Dover, of course, is pretty obvious. When I say manpower, bear in mind that woman power is also used in times of crisis. Remember, Nicola de la Haye commands the defence of Lincoln Castle against Prince Louis's rebel invading army in 1217. And famously, Simon de Montfort came to his end while besieging Toulouse, allegedly hit by a mangonel ball launched by, and I quote, ladies and girls and women who were taking their turn manning the ramparts at Toulouse in 1218. And another point I want to make is that castles were not normally in a state of defence. They were put into such a state when necessary, and sometimes very hastily indeed, and often in response to a royal command. So it's wrong to imagine a permanent garrison. On a day-to-day basis, there would have been very few men-at-arms, just enough to keep the place secure, more like security guards in many respects. And of course, a number of household knights, depending on the size and status of the individual household. In fact, you should also bear in mind that many castles were not often occupied. The higher you go up the social ladder, the more this applies. Wealthy owners, aristocratic owners, kings, bishops had several estates, and sometimes they were abroad, and so often they're away for months on end, even years on end. So you have to bear in mind that castles were often occupied for a very small proportion of their working life, and very often they were just left in the hands of a castellan or a royal constable, or basically a caretaker. Now, I'm showing you a slide here of Odium Castle in Hampshire. In 1216, that same spot of bother that King John had with an invading army from Prince Louis of France. Odium was attacked, the invading army came and set up siege outside, and the so-called garrison consisted of 13 people. They're basically caretakers, and they have to hang on as best they can. So they shut the doors, they loose the odd arrow from the ramparts, and they hold out for a couple of weeks, which I think is not bad going. And then presumably they're running a bit short of food, and the king hasn't sent a relieving force, so they feel it's a reasonable thing to surrender. So bear that in mind as well. We have the constable of, for example, Nottingham Castle frequently informing Henry II that this roof needs repairing and that bit of the hall wall is falling down again. And this is what's going on in the background when the castle is not even occupied. But essentially, I want to concentrate on the castle as a residence. And I'm showing you here a slide. Did I miss one? That's right. This is a site drawing from the excavations at Hen Domen, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Most intensively excavated earth and timber castle to date, and it reveals, I'm showing you a section of the Outer Bailey, the northern quadrant, and it reveals a closely packed hive of activity going on in the Bailey. The outer bailey is generally for lower status activity, service activity, leaving the inner bailey to be more of an elite or polite area for residents. So you're going to expect stabling, you're going to expect storage, granaries, dovecots, poultry houses, possibly smithies. Remember, horses need to be shoed on a frequent basis, and for the general maintenance of the castle, you'd have workshops that were able to allow the castle to remain reasonably self-sufficient. And you need people to carry out all the associated tasks of keeping the castle household going. You need bakers, brewers, cooks, poultry keepers, pig keepers, grooms, stable boys, potentially smiths and even millers. Sometimes castles had their own mills, sometimes on the premises, often in the immediate location. So this is Hyman Barker's reconstruction of that same part of the outer bailey, and the excavation showed that as buildings went into disrepair, they were constantly replaced. There's a constant regeneration of the castle while it's in use. Just very quickly, I'm going to contrast that with this illustration of a Motte Bailey castle lifted off the internet the other day. And look how neat and tidy it is. There's not so much as a chicken running around in there. Okay, it's aimed at children, but even so, it's not a very realistic representation. So let's go upmarket a bit and let's have a look at some documentary sources. And I'm showing you here some references in the pipe rolls to what is going on at Nottingham Castle under Henry II. So in 1177, we've got Henry II spending Christmas at Nottingham Castle, and over the next 11 years, his constable is claiming expenditure for the following. Henry, I will add, spent more on Nottingham Castle than any other of the royal castles except Dover. He's spending £1,800 on Nottingham Castle, which is mega bucks in terms of 12th century royal budgets. So he's spending not only on the confines of the castle, but outside the castle. He's spending on the King's Chamber, that's his private chamber, and the park beneath the castle. So I've highlighted in purple things that are to do with the general household and which might be associated with entertaining activities and recreational activities. He's spending £65 on the castle plus a house in Nottinghamshire, the Clipston. This is a smart royal house which was essentially a hunting lodge. Remember, they're on the doorstep of Sherwood Forest here. He's building a house for the King's Falcons. So if we start to think about who's involved in keeping all this going, you've already got falconers, grooms, stable boys. But he's also spending a pentice, that's a covered walkway within the castle, and an armoury in the bailey. So you're looking at clerks to keep that running. He's spending a new hall that costs him £250. It cost him a lot more and his descendants in terms of maintenance thereafter. It seemed to me that there was something wrong with that hall from the start. The Great Hall is used as the hub of the castle community, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And it's multifunctional, so you'd have great meals there for the entire household being served. So you need servitors, butlers, but it's also going to be used for official, judicial and administrative duties. So clerks would be associated with that as well. And this is not counting the king himself when he's in residence and his entire household. He's flooring out a tower. It's probably the small great tower that appears on a Smithson drawing in the 17th century. Nothing of it still stands up or has been excavated. And who would be using a private tower? Well, members of the king's household, servants, butlers, clerks. You're beginning to get the idea. And then there's work going on various chambers in addition to the king's chamber. Chambers, again, are private spaces. So these are for the use of the king's household, potentially guests, and it's getting repetitive, servers, butlers, clerks. And he actually builds a chamber for the clerks within the castle bailey. So we're starting to get a bit of a view. I'll stress the importance of the hall in the castle household. Every castle had a hall. And I'm showing you a couple of them from the 12th century. On the right, the timber hall that was excavated at Goltho in Lincolnshire, about the same middle of the 12th century. And that was that was a completely aisled building. So there's the central supports, and it's aisled all the way round. This is a tentative reconstruction. But I'm also showing you the stone aisled hall at Oakham, which substantially stands up. That's a central nave. Central nave with an aisle on either side. And the reason this building survives, because there's not much left of the rest of the castle except a few lumps of earth, it survives because its judicial function carries on. It's still being used as a courthouse into the 20th century. So we mustn't forget about that aspect of castle life and the staff needed to keep it going. Privacy, I'm attempting to stress, is that privacy is in great demand, and it's a very rare commodity in the medieval household. Chambers were one solution, and small donjons or towers, great towers, were another one. I'm showing you here the great tower at Goodrich. And what does it consist of? There's a storage basement. You've got an entry at first floor level, a private room there. It's not very big. And then there's a staircase that leads up to a second private room above. These could be used for sleeping in, they could be used for withdrawing in from the general hustle and bustle of the castle life, away from the Great Hall, away from the general household. And it's a building where you could withdraw and take your guests if you wanted to have private conversations on a diplomatic level. So I'll just mention that. Let's move on. Oh, you could also, of course, these private spaces would also be used for sleeping, because to have your own room to sleep in is really very rare in the castle society. I'm showing you here a photograph of the motte at Guines in France in the Pas-de-Calais. And the reason I'm showing this is because we have one written source describing day-to-day private domestic life within a castle donjon. And it relates to a castle belonging to the Counts of Guines at Ardres. Again, there's only a motte there nowadays. There's nothing left of the tower described. It was built in timber. And it's written by Lambert of Ardres in a history that he wrote about the Counts of Guines and the Lords of Ardres. And essentially, it's a biased account. He's glorifying the family of his patron and their ancestors. And he's probably writing at the tail end of the 12th and into the early 13th century, whereas the donjon in question was built by Arnold II around 1120. So it may be a building that he knew at first hand, quite possible, but it's not an absolutely contemporary building that he's talking about. Now, what is interesting, he celebrates the building of this tower at Ardres with a certain amount of hyperbole. He says it was so magnificent it could have been designed by Daedalus. And quite frankly, it's very difficult to envisage how this building would have hung together from his description. But what is interesting is that although he mentions watchmen and guards on the top floor, the rest of the description is wholly concerned with the domestic running of the tower. And it comes across as being actually quite cosy. It's got storerooms, it's got a kitchen, it's even got a place where they're keeping livestock. It has a wonderful chapel, apparently, and a loggia that's used as a parlour, a sitting room, a place for quiet family life. The lord and the lady sleep on the first floor, where there is also a room that is always kept warm for the nursemaids and the babies and the weaned children. So you've got this nice warm nursery. And then further up is where the older children of the family sleep. The girls are confined there at night, naturally. The boys can sleep there as they please. The boys can come and go. I think they're allowed to sow their wild oats, interestingly, but the girls are not, because that would not be a good idea. It's perhaps no coincidence that Lambert makes no secret of his current patron's insatiable sexual appetite and the number of his illegitimate children. That's by the by. Now, although this is a brief description, it gives us this unique insight into the private life within a castle tower. Going back to Nottingham, I'm going to run very briefly through a few of the improvements under Henry III. Note the work to the King's Garden, who's going to be using it, what kind of stuff is going to be involved, building a wall around the King's Herbery, improvements to the Queen's Chapel, and chaplains are another important member of the household which will be coming across. He's rebuilding the King's kitchen. He's putting glazed windows into the Chapel of St. Nicholas in the Keep. Glazed windows are still quite a domestic luxury. He's covering the great chapel with lead, and he's building yet another armoury, a big one, 40 feet long by 25 feet wide. But if we look at the references that highlight his domestic life in particular, his personal life, he's really going for grand designs, it seems to me. There's interior decoration where we've got references to within the King's Chapel. And the chaplain is a very important member in any castle household. He's going to be not only seeing to the spiritual needs of the household, but he's also going to be acting as a kind of civil servant. He's making a new chapel on the entry to his own chamber, and he's putting large and fair windows into the Queen's chamber and its immediate chapel. This preoccupation with improving feminine spaces is something that we shouldn't overlook. He's enlarging her wardrobe, he's putting in a privy for her use. And in the 1240s, he's building 2 new towers in the upper ward, including domestic accommodation. In 1243, he makes a point of writing while he's in Gascony at his estates there. He's writing to his steward in Nottingham, stressing that he wants the second one finished by Michaelmas, and to remind him that he wants 2 fair windows looking towards the cliff and only 1 window looking towards the town. Now, the significance of that is he wants the view. The cliff windows are going to look over the River Trent, and they're going to provide a magnificent view, whereas the one towards the town is going to have all the smoke and the rest of it. Henry shows up regularly at Nottingham every summer for a couple of weeks. It's for the hunting, doubtless, in Sherwood Forest. I think it's a kind of medieval version of the annual golfing holiday. Now, I mentioned earlier this habit of bringing up other people's children in medieval households. So I'll make 1 or 2 references to extra accommodation in that. I'm going to look at a case in a certain amount of detail, nigh on the time. Warkworth in Northumberland, which many of you will be familiar with, is close to the border in Scotland. And although it's a 12th century foundation, it's essentially a modern bailey. And here is the Norman borough, which is laid out in the 12th century in a highly defensible loop of the River Coquet. And it belongs to the Percy Earls of Northumberland from the earlier part of the 14th century. It's quite an important family. And I'm going to look at the accommodation within the Great Tower on the Motte. This one's built round about 1380, probably the ingenious design of John Lewin, Master Mason. And I dare say many of you will have visited this castle, so I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but I'm going to use these English Heritage floor plans just to work out who's using the tower, what it's being used for, and from that we can extrapolate the kind of staff and living accommodation that's available. So English Heritage has very kindly differentiated between public spaces in yellow and domestic and service spaces in pink. And if I take you through, you're coming in the main doorway here into a public space, which is basically an entry lobby. So you've got the Porter's Lodge, you have a place there where the porter can be accommodated and where grooms and pages can be hanging around ready to take guests up the stairs to the next floor. Now those teenagers, those kids that I mentioned being brought up in the household that weren't necessarily of your own family, they would act as, the boys would act as pages, and when they got old enough, they would be taught the requisite skills of their class. So they'd be taught horsemanship, how to handle arms, etc. The girls, similarly, would act as ladies' maids, as ladies' companions to the women of the household. So what else have we got? We've got an accountant room, so we've got clerks, we've got a beer cellar, we've got a food store, we've got further storage in here, and something to do with the water system, which I'll come on to later. And then we've got 2 lots of wine cellars. And what communications have we got? We've got a smart staircase going up to a lobby or waiting room before guests go into the hall. But we've also got handy stairs for up to the kitchens, from the food store and from the beer cellar up to the servery for the hall. So we've got 2 very distinct classes of people using the tower and keeping into their different spaces. When you're living cheek by jowl with the entire household, privacy is one thing you want. Another thing you want is to keep your social status different from the serving classes. And so the architecture of this building is clearly defining who goes where, who does what, and what their function is. So let's pretend we're a guest. We show up here, we're met by the porter, one of the pages takes us up here. We wait in the hall, in the lobby area for the hall, because we might be coming to pay taxes, we might be coming to do some official business, more likely in this private tower where we've been invited to come to dinner. So we come in, we wash our hands from a ewer held in a shelf here, which somebody has had to fill, somebody from the staff, and then we come into the hall where we are seated for our meal. Meanwhile, the food's being brought up, it's being prepared in the kitchen, the pastry kitchen. We've got the buttery pantry all ready for the off, and the beers come up to serve the low end of the hall, but the wine is coming up this way. This is the butler's little domain here, because the wine is going to the high end of the hall. There's a social differentiation between what you get. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, there is a kind of mezzanine level over the kitchen, which would have been a very nice warm place. It's not easily seen by visitors because it's really accessible by ladder. I have been up there, and I suspect it was used as a dormitory above the kitchen for the kitchen staff to sleep. Otherwise, back to the guest, he's in the hall, or she's in the hall. The hall has direct access to the chapel, and there's a sacristy off the chapel which is big enough for the chaplain to have slept in. So that may have been a private bedroom for the chaplain as well as the sacristy. And then beyond the chapel, there is a great chamber where very distinguished guests might have been taken for more private talks with the Earl. And off the great chamber, his bed would doubtless have been in there. You have further inner chambers and things like guardrobes for clothes for using the loo, etc. And I think we'll move on quickly to the top floor now, which is practically 100% private space. This is not designed for the hoi polloi of the castle. And we do have a service stair that's going all the way to the top. So this is where servants will be emerging to serve the needs of those in these private spaces. The Great Chamber is a double height chamber because it's very smart, whereas the chambers around the Great Chamber are single story. And that goes to the chapel as well. That's why there's a big hole there. The upper part of the chapel is because the chapel's a double height space. But we have private chambers, plenty of them, and they have access to, it's not very clear on the plan, but because it's a very difficult thing to depict, but they are giving access to a private pew that overlooks the chapel, so that the people in this extremely remote and private space at the top of the tower can attend chapel in the Great Tower, but not be amongst everyone who's attending chapel in the Great Tower. They're going to be down in the bottom space. You have a similar thing that's built at Ludlow for Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur. You know, they build that corridor coming off the residential accommodation so that they can sit separate from the rest of the congregation. And I talked about female spaces earlier, and even at Ard, they're talking about the girls being confined to the top floor and being confined there at night to make sure they don't get into any trouble. I'm not suggesting that that's the purpose here, but I'm suggesting that this is to do with high status removal from the hoi polloi and the status that applies to private spaces. Now, move on. On this, again, English Heritage Cutaway, it shows a very tall lookout tower that runs right the way up through the centre of the building. You see this gap here? That's to accommodate, that's to accommodate this lookout tower. And this lookout tower actually consists of a very narrow staircase. I have been up it. And off the staircase, there are a whole series of tiny little rooms, each with their own window. And I'm quite convinced that these are sleeping accommodation for all these, you know, these pages, these kids that they've got to accommodate. And they're coming, some of them from quite high status households, so they maybe are entitled to a room of their own, but that they can't have a very big one because they're not that high status yet. And so they're stashing, I think they're stashing all these kids in these little rooms, wherever they can find a space to put them. But it's also for lookout duties on the top of the tower. You can see for miles from this thing. And the rainwater ingeniously gets collected and runs down to a kind of cistern in the cellar. So altogether, it's a very sophisticated plan. And I'm just about to finish here. Going back to, remember this tower isn't built till the latter end of the 14th century. Going back to the Bailey area at large, we have a hall, we've got a kitchen, we've got the services, we've got a chamber block at this end, we've got a castle chapel. So you've got a duplication of everything that's gone on in the tower, but this is the really public face of the castle. And within the Great Hall, even in the 15th century, they're making improvements. They've got this smart tower, but in the next century, they're building on not one, but two posh porches to go into this hall. And then above each porch, there's a small chamber. Again, are we stashing other people's kids up there in these chambers? Or are they higher members of the Earl's household? We've got a fine chamber block here with another chamber in the tower. We've got a chapel, a public chapel for the entire household. We've got a smart gatehouse, clearly a defensive element, but it's also got accommodation over it. And in the later 15th, 16th century, they're going to build, they don't get it finished because the Earl goes and gets himself executed, but they are going to build a massive collegiate church. And this is another element of later medieval castles that I haven't had time to go into. It becomes a great fashionable thing to have a big church with a college of canons attached to your castle. Very often outside the castle, but this one was going to be inside the castle. And then there would have needed to have been accommodation for the College of Canons as well. So you've got your own little mini religious establishment within the castle. And outside was evidence for fish ponds. I haven't got into any of that. The keepers of the fish ponds were probably not living within the castle anyway. But are you beginning to get an idea of the range of people that would be necessary to keep the castle running? And just to finish, I feel obliged to explain my title. There is a bishop's palace in Angers, in Maine, in France, and there's an inscription in the upper hall, the salle synodale of this bishop's palace, and it says, "The priest and knight may come in, but the lower orders must go elsewhere, for this fine room is suitable for the former, and the humble downstairs room for the latter." Now, it's probably a joke. It's probably a kind of intellectual bit of irony. But for any joke to work, for any satirical comment to work, it has to ring a bell with reality. And so what I've tried to get across to you is that as the medieval castle got bigger and bigger and bigger, there was this desire to provide the capacity for some social distinction to be maintained. And just to end, those poor people who were confined to the lower hall, I'm just showing you the lower hall in the papal palace at Avignon. There's my beloved husband, so that gives you scale. So maybe the lower hall wasn't that bad after all. Okay, thank you for listening.
Got time for a couple of quick questions. I should just say for the people at home, I apologise for you won't be able to see me because I'm moving around the audience.
There is a lady here, oh sorry.
Probably not able to see me either, which is just as well. I've always been fascinated in these castles, concentration of people. Can you tell us anything about basic sanitation? We have a reference in there to a privy being provided for the Queen, but that was the only point at which it cropped up.
No, they're really not bad, you know, with sanitation. They do have guardrobes laid on. If you think of castles like Alford, great towers like Alford, there's a good provision for sanitation. And in fact, one of the rooms two rooms are interpreted as kitchens. I'm half inclined to think that one of them might even be a bathroom. And we know that King John pays 4p for a bath. That's what it costs him to have a bath in his household. So they are bathing. I think there were more loos than you think of. I think the privies in the Outer Baileys would have been a bit on the basic side, but heaven knows there were lots of basic outside privies in this country in the 19th, even into the early 20th century in rural spots. So I don't think that's particularly unusual. I think the highlight of that comment is that the privy in Nottingham is for the use of the Queen herself, Queen Eleanor herself, not for just anybody.
Thank you, that was absolutely fascinating. I had a question about the kids that get stashed in the town and the entertainers and so on. Would those children typically have, as the Lord's household moved on from site to site, would those sort of adopted children have moved with the household, or would they have been more...
No, they would have been part of the household. So when the household moves on, the whole household moves, and they leave the castle in the hands of caretakers. The idea was that the children wouldn't be spoilt. It's a bit like public school, it's the same kind of idea. And that if they were brought up by people who were not their parents, they would get a more disciplined upbringing, and the boys would be taught the skills that they needed, and so would the girls. And the idea was usually that you try to get your kids into a household with slightly higher status, so they're all trying to work their way up the ladder as they went along, and that the girls would similarly get all the education that they needed, the religious instruction, the talents that they needed to make good wives, and they might actually be introduced to better marriage prospects in a better household.
Thanks, Pam. We'll just take one more question. There's a couple come through from people at home, so I'll just ask Clive to read out one of those questions, and then we'll need to move on.
Okay.
Hollywood films have lots of serving wenches, but how many female staff would there have actually been, and in what sort of roles?
I think the staff would largely have been male. I think the serving wench is beloved of ye olde medievally feast that you get in certain pubs and what have you. But I think the staff was largely male, but that is not to discount the role of their wives, who were often working alongside their husbands, but they're not recognised as employees. Almost the wife is considered a kind of adjunct to the husband. So I don't think these are all celibate males who are serving in the household, but it's predominantly a male class of servitor.
Okay, thank you very much, Pamela. That was fascinating insights, and quite for many of us, quite a very different talk. So thank you very much. You've achieved superbly what I was hoping when I sort of had the concept of asking you to talk. So that's
Thank you.
Thank
That's
you very
very
much.
kind.